This week, we're going to take a look at the sociocultural factors impacting equity and access in educational contexts. Before we jump into sociocultural factors, let's take another look at motivation. In the readings, you read about 3 motivation indicators that can be used to determine whether a person is motivated or unmotivated. They are active choice of behavior, level of activity and involvement, and persistence in management of effort. Let's take a look at each of these individually. With active choice of behavior, the important word here is active. Not only is there intention to engage in a behavior, but there is active choice. The person is actually behaving in a manner that will help them accomplish whatever goal they've set in front of them. So if you are ever trying to tell whether someone is into something or not, you can look to see if they're actively choosing to engage in that task. If not, they're most likely less than motivated. With level of activity and involvement, this is the depth of involvement that you engage in the task. Are you merely just trying to accomplish the task and get it over with, or are you deeply involved mentally or physically or emotionally in the activity? Think about your textbooks. Think about a class that you may have been highly motivated for, as opposed to a class that you may have not enjoyed so much. Your textbook in the class where you were highly motivated probably looked more used. This is a way that professors can often tell whether a student is really motivated or as motivated as they say they are. Is there writing in your textbook? Are there notes? Is there highlighting? Are there pages that are dog-eared? Does the book look used, or does it still look like you purchased it off the shelf? When considering persistence and management of effort, ask yourself, what does it take for you to quit? Think about an activity where you may have been less motivated. It may have been very easy for you to become distracted, or you may have not pushed through obstacles, but even though the obstacle wasn't that difficult. Someone come by knocking on your dorm room or texting you may have pulled you away from the task that you were engaged in. The lack of persistence through the task speaks to a lack of motivation. People who are truly motivated persist despite incredible barriers. Think about a time when you were highly motivated, when there may have been several distractions or very difficult obstacles that were in your way, but you were able to maneuver around them, find new strategies, or find another place where you would be less distracted. While we're looking at these 3 indices in an academic context, these indices can also be used for other contexts, such as your social life. So for example, if you're ever trying to determine whether or not he or she is that into you, you can take these 3 indicators and use them to measure your significant other's motivation. Are they merely telling you they want to spend time with you, or are they actively choosing to make time for you in their life? What about level of activity and involvement? So they do choose to spend time with you, but they're sitting next to you and they're constantly texting or looking at Facebook or other social media. And they're there, but they're not really involved, or their level of involvement is not very deep. And lastly, persistence or management of effort. They get a phone call from their friend that asks them to go hang out, and they tell you, sorry, I've been trying to hang out with this friend for a while, I'll have to catch up with you later. With one distraction or with one obstacle put in the way, if their level of effort decreases, then they might not be that into you. What about if they tell you, but I really love you. I really want to spend time with you. I'm just so distracted right now. I just have a lot of things on my mind. Are convincing use of words an indicator of motivated behavior? Absolutely not. This is true for extracurricular activities, for social life, for academic pursuits. Talk is cheap. We need to look for actions. When we're looking for motivation, actions speak louder than words. We are looking for active choice. We are looking for deep involvement. And we are looking through persistence and heavy management of effort through obstacles. Let's revisit our matrix from last week and examine the 3 indices of motivation. What would these indices look like in each of these boxes? Looking at these 4 types of students, the failure acceptors, success-oriented students, failure avoiders, and overstrivers, who would choose to engage in learning and choose a more challenging task? Which students would most likely procrastinate? Which students would get heavily involved and give their full mental effort? and which students would just aim to complete the task using minimal effort. Which students might not complete the task at all. Finally, which students would persist through obstacles, and which might give up in the face of too many challenging obstacles. Let's take a look at specifically the success-oriented students and the failure avoiders to see what these three indices would look like for each. First, we're going to look at the failure avoiders, and just to recap from last week, someone who tends to be a failure avoider tends to have a very low motivation to approach success, but a very high motivation to avoid failure. So they're not necessarily going to engage very deeply in their tasks, but they are going to try to accomplish something at a minimal effort, so they avoid looking like a complete failure. The three indices, active choice of behavior, level of activity and involvement, and persistence and management of effort, would look different in this box than it would in the success-oriented students. For a student who's very motivated to avoid failure, they will engage in tasks, but they will tend to procrastinate, tend to wait till the last minute, because they're not trying to approach success. They're not trying to give their best effort. They just want to get the task completed. These students will not only tend to procrastinate, but once they are involved, their level of involvement will not be very deep. This type of student, when studying for an exam, may engage in more rote-type learning. They most likely won't want to put the level of effort in that it takes to use more meaningful learning strategies. For this reason, students who are failure avoiders may not completely fail an exam or fail a task, but they likely won't be successful. First, because they've procrastinated and waited till the last minute, and second, because the level of effort that they engage in when actually doing the task is low. Lastly, these students tend to be very distractible and tend to give up in the face of obstacles. Again, a student who is a failure avoider doesn't want to be seen as a complete failure, but isn't necessarily highly motivated to reach a level of success. This is very different from a student who has a high need to approach success, who is very much focused on accomplishing their goals and giving their best effort. This student does not have a lot of anxiety because their motivation to avoid failure is low, and so this student will not only actively choose to engage in a task, but they will actively choose challenging tasks because they know that if they encounter failure with a task, they'll be able to use this failure as learning and improve in the future. They're not anxious about being seen as a failure or failing in general. These types of students see failure as more of a process than an endpoint. Because students who are success-oriented have a very high motivation to approach success, they want to jump in and learn as best they can. This usually results in a very deep level of learning, a very deep level of involvement in the activity. These students tend to set more challenging goals for themselves and engage at a much deeper level. For example, a student who is a success-oriented student most likely would engage in more meaningful learning strategies because their goal is to learn and to master the content. It's not just to avoid failure. Lastly, it would take an exceptional obstacle to shake the persistence and effort of success-oriented students. They don't tend to be distractible. These students tend to be highly self-regulated, which results in their strategizing in anticipation of distractions and obstacles. Next, we're going to take a look at possible selves. What are possible selves? The article that we read said that possible selves are the future-oriented component of a multifaceted self-concept. Let's first take a look at this word self-concept. Think of all of the roles that you play in your life, as a man or a woman, as a son or a daughter, brother or sister, undergraduate student, freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, a Trojan, a significant other, a member of a club or a fraternity or sorority, a Californian, possibly a surfer, an athlete, a soccer player, a musician, an artist, a dancer. Our self-concept encompasses all of these roles we play in our life, and our possible selves are our hopes, dreams, fears, and expectations for the future of these roles. Think about yourself in the role of a student. What are your hopes and expectations for yourself after graduation? Do you have a fear of the consequences that may result if you don't accomplish these expectations? Do you often imagine or visualize yourself in this future role? This is your possible self as a student. Let's look a little deeper into our possible selves. Our possible selves are both positive and negative, and there's almost a dance between these hopes and fears that we have for our future. We balance these hopes and fears, and they are both needed in order to be well-rounded and adjusted. For example, you may have positive expectations about graduating from USC with a bachelor's degree and going on to acquire a full-time job that will launch you into a successful career. On the other hand, you may also have fears of not acquiring the job of your dreams, possibly not making enough money, or living a life that you deem as less than successful. Both of these possible selves are important and impact your motivation. But where do they come from? Although our possible selves are what we imagine for ourselves in the future, we very much derive them from our past and present. They come from our own experiences and our beliefs about our past behavior or accomplishments. They also come from the beliefs of what important others think we should become. For example, maybe in your family there are a line of lawyers or a line of doctors, and it's the belief in your family that you should go into the family business. This may have been something that is talked about a lot as you are an undergraduate student, but is probably something that has been talked about a lot when you were younger as well. All the while building this image of your future self as a doctor. Our possible selves also come from our own values, ideals, and aspirations, what we have personal interest in, what we see as important for our self-concept, and what we see as useful for ourselves. They're also very much connected to what we aspire to be and aspire to do, our hopes, our dreams, and what we imagine ourselves being in our future. So think about the last time you were daydreaming, about who you would be next year, or in 5 years, or in 10 years, where you would be living, what you would look like, who you would be with, what you would be doing. This is a time when you were engaging and imagining your possible self. Now that we've looked a little closer at motivation and our possible selves, let's go back to our sociocultural factors. Sociocultural factors are the factors in the classroom, home, and sociocultural context that impact our learning and motivation. These could be past school experiences, the relationships that we develop with instructors or classmates or other participants in our education, how we interact or participate in school activities, or familial expectations that have been instilled in us as we've grown. So thinking about this class, think about any experiences you've had in the past with the psychology course. Was it positive or negative? How did you interact with the instructor in your past course or your classmates? How did this experience impact your learning and motivation as you entered this current course? Think about yourself in the broader context of being an undergraduate student. What are your familial expectations? Were you expected to come to college? Or was this something that you had to seek out for yourself? What about your friends in high school? Did all of them apply to college? Was this something that was the norm in your social context? What about in your larger high school setting? Was there a lot of activity and conversation around applying for college and taking the necessary steps to get there? If you've had this experience where it is the norm in your social setting to go to college and pursue a 4-year degree or maybe even a graduate degree, think about if you were in a setting where it wasn't the norm, where no one else was applying, where no conversations were being had between classmates or with instructors or with parents or other family members, where college was the topic and you weren't encouraged to go. How would this have impacted your motivation? How would it have impacted your learning in high school? Once you were in college, would it continue to impact your learning and motivation? Our social context has a very big impact on our learning and motivation, whether it's around formal learning, such as higher education, or about more informal learning, such as the value for things like learning to swim or speak more than one language. In more formal settings, we also have school and classroom factors that impact our learning. These can be the class size and makeup. Think about a time when you were either in a very large lecture hall or in a very small, intimate classroom. This impacted whether or not you could hide or whether you had to participate. Think about the diversity of the class. Were there students that were very similar to you, or were there a lot of different perspectives coming into the classroom to add to the conversation? Think about the instructional methods of your instructors. Some professors may prefer collaboration over individual work. If you prefer individual work, this may have impacted your learning and motivation negatively. What about the level of feedback that a professor gives? In educational psychology, we know that timely feedback directly impacts motivation of students. Think about classes where you may have been graded on a curve. How did this impact your motivation, especially if it was a class that you didn't personally enjoy? Along with instructional methods, our instructors also have characteristics. Some may be very approachable and more friendly. Others may be distant and less approachable. Oftentimes, we're impacted by the level of enthusiasm that our professors have. If a professor is very enthusiastic or excited about the subject they're teaching, this tends to increase our motivation. Whereas if a professor tends to be more of a passive speaker or more monotone, it's very easy for us to be distracted or even to tune out the professor's voice. All of these school and classroom factors impact the level of learning and motivation that we have. This is why it's very important to become a self-regulated learner so that we can strategize and we may overcome obstacles that may come from school, classroom, or other sociocultural factors. One of the more negative sociocultural factors that can impact our learning and motivation is known as stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the fear of doing something that would inadvertently confirm a stereotype. An important note about stereotype threat is that we do not have to believe the stereotype in order to be threatened by it. Think about yourself now and think about the roles that you play. Some of these roles may have a stereotype about them in society. There are 8 parts of our identity where we may have encountered stereotypes. They are age, ability, whether it's physical or mental ability, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status or class, religion, sexual orientation, and gender. If you think about all of the experiences you've had over your lifetime, from jokes that you've heard, to movies you've watched, to magazines that you've seen, we've encountered a lot of things through media or through personal experiences with other people that have taught us these stereotypes. Again, we do not have to believe the stereotype ourselves in order to be threatened by it. It's also important to note that stereotype threat does not reduce the level of effort that a person is giving to whatever task they are taking on, but it makes this person try harder in order to invalidate the stereotype. This results in high anxiety, which in turn lowers performance. If we think back to a couple lectures ago when we were learning about the information processing system, we can think about the working memory and how it has an issue with a very small capacity and a very short duration. Because our working memory has a very limited capacity, it's very important that when we are facing a task that's more challenging, such as taking an exam, that we attend to it with 100% of our working memory capacity. But we know from previous readings that worry and anxiety can cloud our working memory, can take up some of this limited capacity, either with physiological symptoms or with cognitive worry. This in turn results in lowered performance. So what are some of these academic stereotypes, and how do we learn them? If we take gender, for example, and we think about some of the stereotypes about gender, you may recall having heard or encountered somewhere in the media that women are not supposed to be as good in math as men. So if you think about a young woman who's at the end of her high school career and is going to take the SAT in order to apply for colleges, she may encounter stereotype threat if one of the following things occur. First of all, she has to have encountered the stereotype through some experiences in society. These could be things on TV, billboards, magazines, jokes that she's heard, or even hearing a female teacher say that she's not very good at math. Secondly, when she's in the testing situation, her gender needs to be made salient. This could be something as simple as having to check the box of whether or not she's male or female. Subconsciously, when she notes herself as female, her gender is made salient to her, and then the stereotype that she's aware of becomes a threat. This stereotype threat will actually propel her to want to put out her best effort and to dispel the threat. It's important to note that most people that encounter stereotype threat do not believe in the stereotype and actually work hard to disprove it. In studies with children as young as 7 and 8, it's been shown that female students taking math tests that encounter stereotype threat actually do better than males on the easier problems. It's when they encounter more difficult problems that lowered performance arises. With more difficult problems, the need for working memory capacity increases. Without the full capacity of working memory to focus on the more difficult problem, it results in lower performance. This has been shown repeatedly with children as young as 7 and 8, with young women taking the SAT, with women taking the GRE trying to get into graduate school. So we know that stereotypes are out there. We can't disengage from society in order to not be exposed to them. So what do we do about stereotypes? One way to reduce it is to think of ourselves as a whole person, to de-emphasize the social identity that is being stereotyped. For example, the young woman who is taking the SAT and is thinking of herself as a young woman who's taking a math test. She needs to realize that she's not only a young woman, that she is also a daughter or a sister or a soccer player. She may be on the honor roll or a dancer or a singer. She may be a computer whiz or a star on social media. She basically needs to think of her complex self-concept. She needs to think of herself beyond this one social identity. Another way to reduce stereotype threat would be to find a role model, someone who's similar to you. So if this young woman, before taking the SAT, found another woman or young woman who had taken the SAT and been successful, and possibly found a woman who was very successful in a math or science field, this would actually not only increase her self-efficacy, but would also be a way for her to begin to dispel the stereotype so that she can create another belief about how women perform when engaging in math tasks. Lastly, but most importantly, it's been shown that an incremental view of intelligence, also known as a malleable view of intelligence or a growth mindset, has been shown to reduce stereotype threat. This has been labeled as attribution retraining. Students who attribute their successes and failures to their own effort and not to some type of stereotype or some type of talent that they were born with have been shown to be able to increase performance when normally stereotype threat would lower it. Incremental views of intelligence or growth mindsets are extremely important in impacting success. And again, recent studies have shown that both high school and college students who would normally fall victim to stereotype threat have been able to avoid lower academic performance by focusing on the impact of their effort to their successes and failures. Finally, as you're learning this week, reflect on these questions. In order to determine if you're motivated, ask yourself, are you choosing challenging tasks? Are you heavily involved in giving your best mental effort? Are you persisting through obstacles? What sociocultural factors are and have been impacting your learning and motivation? What stereotypes may be impacting your academic performance? How can these be addressed? What hopes and dreams do you have for your future self? Where did these come from?